probably go ahead and get started. I'm sure maybe a few more people will trickle in the next few minutes. But yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Air Quality Access, how you can use public records and other data sources to get answers about what's in your air. My name is Dillon Bergin. I am a data reporter at MuckRock, and I will be hosting this webinar. Oops, got a few more coming in. I will be hosting this webinar along with Anthony Moser, who will introduce himself in a moment. For those new to us, MuckRock is a nonprofit collaborative news site that gives you the tools to keep your government transparent and accountable. We often say you because though I'm a journalist myself and spend a lot of my days working with journalists in other newsrooms, we want our tools and work to be used by as many people as possible and not just journalists. In that vein, today, Anthony and I are going to give you a roadmap on how to ask your local government what's going on with your air quality. I'm going to outline several types of documents you can request, and then Anthony is going to dive into the process of requesting and obtaining some of those documents. I just wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and I'm going to drop some links in the chat intermittently when I have a second to a Google Doc where you can find various links and write any questions you want to ask Anthony and I when we finish our presentation. Everyone can edit that document and you can leave notes for yourself or for others, but that is available to everyone to read and edit, so your notes will be seen by anyone who has access to that Google Doc. The slides for our presentation are also at the top of that Google Doc, but those are read-only. So yeah, without further ado, I'll start by letting Anthony introduce himself.
Hey, I'm Anthony Moser, and thank you, Dillon, for that introduction and for having me here today. And yeah, I am the board president for a group called Neighbors for Environmental Justice. We are on the southwest side of Chicago, and we got started in our neighborhood when an asphalt plant opened up right across from the big park, right in the middle of our community. And that's kind of been my journey into the world of environmental organizing, and I do a lot of kind of data and research stuff in connection to that, and I do a lot of like tooling type of things where trying to make public data more accessible.
Yeah, so I'm Dillon Bergin. Like I said, I'm the data reporter for MuckRock. For the past year or so, we've been working on some data analysis and reporting on air quality in Chicago. On the left here, you can see a map of Chicago using air quality sensors placed by the tech company Microsoft across the city. In this map, we're estimating the air quality across neighborhoods based on the readings at those sensors. In the top right corner, you can see one of our first articles we wrote using data from those sensors. That was as a part of a partnership with WBZ and Chicago Public Media. We've also been trying our best to make all the tools and analysis we do as public and accessible and reproducible as possible. In the right-hand corner, you can see a GitHub page that is also, or GitHub repository that is also linked in the Google Doc page that until fairly recently was recording readings every day. I just paused it yesterday because it looked like something was going wrong with the actual data that was being pulled in. But basically that repository is pulling in readings from all the sensors that you can see on the left side of the map, aggregating and cleaning that data. And there's hopefully some useful documentation on how that works and what you can do with it inside that repository. This summer, I also wrote 3 air quality and public records guides that you see here on the right-hand side of the screen. My goal in those guides was to do some research for myself, but also then after doing that research and talking to other journalists, write about it in a way that anyone can follow and hopefully then file those same records requests. So you can find a link to that in the Google Doc as well. That series is broken up into 3 parts. The first part is planning. How do local governments plan for air quality and air pollution? Then permitting, and then finally enforcing regulations through violations or fines. Anthony's got a lot to share on that end today. So yeah, and that's going to be the types of records that I I talk about in the next 15 or so minutes. So I'm going to start with planning, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Clean Air Act, SIPs, and environmental impact statements. So each part of my presentation today is going to have 3 slides with 3 types of documents. As you can see here, I'm going to talk a little bit about what those documents are very broadly, and then where you can get them and what you could use them for. So the first type of document in this kind of planning bucket is the state implementation plan or air pollution control plans. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, was codified in 1969 by the feds. And as a part of that, the Clean Air Act was also codified. And basically that sets the laws that we're going to be talking about today, or the documents that are made by those laws. State implementation plans are one of the ways that those laws from the federal level trickle down to states and local levels as they figure out how to meet the standards of the Air Quality Act and of NEPA at their level. So the state implementation plans are not going to tell you a lot of what's going on at your neighborhood or in your neighborhood, or at a very local level, but they are a blueprint for meeting the Clean Air Act standards in your area. And so that kind of tells you what the broader emission targets are and the biggest priorities and challenges to clean air in your area. That could be at the state level or at a regional level. This kind of document will kind of tell you what your government is actually most concerned about, depending on the different types of pollution sources near you or in your area, and kind of the topological or geographical makeup of your area. There are air basins in California that have completely different problems atmospherically than places in the Midwest. So yeah, the easiest way to find these is just to find your local air agency and explore their website. These are usually pretty available on those types of websites. The second document I want to talk about are environmental impact statements. Again, like state implementation plans, they were codified in NEPA for federal projects, and at a local level, they are also very interesting and important, though they may not always apply or happen as often as they do for the very specific federal projects that NEPA specified. Some states do require it though, like Minnesota. I know Minnesota has a very specific air emissions risk analysis. New York City also has a very specific environmental impact statement and review process. So again, you just kind of have to figure out what it looks like at the local or state scale that you're interested in. But these documents in general, they identify and disclose any environmental harms in advance of new infrastructure or business planning. The best way to figure out where these documents are is to call a local planner in your area and just talk to them about what, if a new building or a new highway or something like that were to be planned, what type of environmental documents would have to be filed with the city or the state. You can also check out the federal EIS database that I linked there for environmental impact statements at the federal scale. The last kind of document related to planning here are health studies. These also, just like the state implementation plans, kind of tell you what your local government knows and is already concerned about or prioritizing. Again, this will be highly dependent on where you are, but I've seen these commissioned by local health departments. I'm thinking about the Houston Health Department that partnered with the Environmental Integrity Project to study air toxics from chemical plants and cancer rates in Houston. So those would also be a good place to start. And again, probably the way to get to these type of documents or to know what's already out there is just to get on the phone with your health department and ask what they've been up to. They may also already be public, or there may be an ongoing project that your health department is working on related to air quality. So these aren't the sexiest or most exciting documents, but the planning documents will kind of give you an overview of what is already known or of a big concern by local government in your area. So yeah, here on the left, you can see an example of a state implementation plan. That one's from New Mexico. Again, what's interesting is you can see that what they're concerned about or what they're trying to plan for to meet Clean Air Act standards is for ozone emissions, and specifically ozone emissions that are contributing to pollution in Colorado. On the right side, you'll see an environmental impact statement from the building of a high school in Hawaii. This was just interesting to me. I had done a Google search for draft environmental impact statement and then just done file type PDF just to see some examples of different environmental impact statements at different scales. So if you're just kind of looking to get an idea of what an environmental impact statement looks like and what kind of air quality considerations would be in them, I mean, you could click that link there or just kind of do the same type of search that I did. And again, in the articles that I wrote this past summer, I tried to give as many good examples to get a good idea of what you would be asking for if you were looking for an environmental impact statement for a specific project. So the next bucket here is permitting, permits, and emission inventories. The first type of document that's interesting here is just the air pollution permit. And then what comes out of that is often an annual air pollutant report. It's a form basically just declaring what type and how much pollutants a facility will emit. It's, again, this is dependent on where you are, but in some areas, any facility emitting air pollution will have to define what equipment, what pollutants, and how much of those pollutants they will be emitting. Again, this is self-reported, so that has to be taken with a grain of salt and then verified in different ways, because what people on the ground may be telling you may be different than what the air pollution permit says. But they're a good way to get a general idea of where the city or area that you're in is planning for and permitting the most pollution to happen, and what type of equipment is driving that pollution, and maybe what type of pollutants are behind it. The annual air pollutant report comes out of the permit in many places. Again, it's self-reporting, but it's a requirement for permit holders, often called an emission inventory, basically saying at the end of the year, here's what our permit says, here's what we actually polluted. These two are kind of the more fun and interesting types of permitting documents, or types of documents that we're going to be talking about today. Startups, shutdowns, and malfunctions. These are kind of like the OOPS document for permitted facilities that emit beyond what they're supposed to. Again, self-reported. I will keep qualifying that because there are many things that are happening that are not documented. But basically, this is a document that facilities have to file for excess emissions or other accidents that happened in the last year. So where would you find this type of document? They have different names. I've seen them in different names in different places. So the first thing would be to figure out what your state or local government calls this type of document and file a request. Like mine, you can follow that link. That's a request that I filed in MuckRock. You can clone it and file it elsewhere. I think that one I'm still waiting for a response back, and I had filed it probably several months ago. So that's something I'll have to follow up on. Again, you may have to really do the kind of elbow grease work to get these type of documents or this data from your local government. But if there are air pollution permits and annual pollutant reports in your area, startup shutdowns and malfunctions may also be a type of document or a type of form that that facilities with permits have to fill out. In that vein, there is another related document called a new source review. This is basically a form declaring any modifications to an active permit, especially to equipment that have changed over time. You can see this would be really interesting or really important, especially to pay close attention to language about tune-ups that could downplay larger capacity creep. So new source reviews are kind of related to the startup shutdowns and malfunctions, that they kind of give you a more granular picture of, okay, this is what the permit says, this is what's actually happening. Yeah, the way to find these, again, is to figure out the specific name that your local government uses for these, and you'll very likely have to request these. I think I went back and forth for a while with the Illinois EPA on what this document was, and they eventually said if I wanted to look at the database of new source reviews, I had to come to Springfield, Illinois, and view them in person. They couldn't send it to me. Anthony's eyebrows are going up. So yeah, so again, this may be hard to find. You may have to figure out the right name for it and go back and forth with a public information officer. But it's a really interesting type of document to keep track of, especially thinking about how there might be some kind of capacity creep at different permitted facilities. These two journalistic articles are, I think, really great examples of reporting done using those types of documents. The one on the left, A Path to Poison, was published by the Texas Tribune. They were able to get access to, or I think it may actually have already been open and not just public, the Air Emission Event Report database, which is a very general and deliberately maybe ambiguous name for startup shutdowns and malfunctions. And basically they took this data on startup shutdowns and malfunctions and looked at where this was happening the most and used some other data from that data set. So that's a great article to check out using that type of document. As for air pollution permits, I often think about this investigation by the Detroit Free Press, Keith Mahaney and Christy Tanner. They were able to get all the permits from the state of Michigan, and then they mapped them to kind of say, okay, where are we approving the most permits, what types of neighborhoods, and then compared these by race across the whole state. So again, that's a really awesome investigation that gives you an idea of what you could do with these types of documents and data. The last bucket I'm going to cover is enforcement, which is complaints, enforcement actions, and lawsuits. This is, I think, a lot of what Anthony's going to get into in detail, but just to go over them a little bit more briefly. Complaints, what these are non-emergency complaints submitted through forms or portals like a local 311 number. Again, not every area in the country has such a portal or a hub, but if you do, you should try to figure out if there's a specific category for air pollution or dust complaints, or how you might otherwise find those in the midst of all the other type of 311 complaints. If you do find a portal like that, or there's a number online and it describes how to file those type of complaints and what happens after, that's really useful because you can then follow that trail of what your local government says they're doing and what what the documents they'd be making at each step of the process would be, and then request the raw input. The link there to the raw input goes to 311 complaints I got from the city of Chicago. I talked a little bit about this with Anthony. Basically, on the Chicago Open Data Portal, they have one part of the process of that 311 complaint, which is kind of like a note that the person who's investigating it writes down as after or when they're investigating the complaint. The specific document that I was interested in, the specific data that I was interested in, was the RAWs form of those complaints. So if it's a text message, I wanted the actual text message that people sent, or the exact like written report that someone who was on the phone was writing down as they were talking to someone on the phone. Sometimes those aren't the same because there's multiple parts of the process. Then there is the big and kind of more complicated category of inspections, violations, and enforcement. Again, I think Anthony knows a lot more about this than I do, but basically these are the steps that regions and states take to keep facilities in compliance with the laws that I've been talking about for the last 20 or so minutes. They can be documented at the local, state, or federal level. Again, it really depends how your area is implementing the Clean Air Act laws. But what they are the kind of steps that steps to keep polluters in compliance with regulations. And they can be used to pinpoint facilities that are problematic, that continue to have violations. And it can help you assess like Anthony will show, if your government really has the power to stop those polluters, or what actual steps they're taking to stop those polluters, whether through fines or through legal actions. You can find these by starting with something called a notice of violation. I think across states and local air agencies, I've kind of found that that language is the most common one to get people to know what you're talking about, especially when it differs on like exactly how that works. The last type of document here would be lawsuits. It's pretty obvious. These are legal action taken against polluters usually on the basis of the Clean Air Act. And the best way to find these are to probably to start to talk to state or local environmental nonprofits, and then dig into the dockets. In some cases, state or local government may be filing these lawsuits. In a lot of cases, it's environmental agencies. And then, yeah, as for a example of these type of documents, I'm going to leave the inspections and violations to Anthony. Here's an example of the raw input of 311 complaints. And you can see, at least it felt like to me, these are a lot more detailed and telling than the type of documents that I was, or the type of data that I was seeing on the portal that was just like the summary of these. Callers reporting that the restaurant Ping Pong has strong, nasty food smell. Like, you don't get more detailed than that. And if you click those links, you can see those are from 2010 to 2022. And there's been varying different types of 311 infrastructure. So not all the data is, the formatted in the same way. But this could be a good place to see what's going on the ground. Again, complaints aren't corroborated. They're starting points, but especially if you see these mounting up on specific facilities or in specific areas, that can tell you a lot. And with that, I'm going to pass this off to Anthony.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a great overview of a ton of different kinds of documentation that's out there. And I guess one thing that my focus is mostly about city level stuff. This is where we were trying to get a picture of how the city of Chicago has or has not really been enforcing the environmental laws here. I guess one thing I want to mention just about like kind of the broader context of this stuff is like, in theory, the federal government is supposed to be kind of setting big picture baselines around this stuff. And then the states would be kind of filling in a lot of, details and more specific kind of context. And then like a city level, would be kind of the most most close to home, right? Of the literally of like, sending people out to do inspections all the time or do whatever. And they are all, potentially collecting different kinds of things. One issue is that in practice, sometimes rather than that being like sort of a nesting situation of like progressively more detailed and specific stuff, it kind of just turns into a bunch of finger pointing where they're like, well, the state told us this, and the state's like, well, that's up to the city, and they can kind of all, point at each other as reasons for why they aren't doing things. So, that dynamic is definitely a kind of in the background of some of this stuff. So this is a report that we just released last month that goes over a particular kind of data. I actually it's centered around hearings level data, basically. We have a Department of Administrative Hearings, same kind of place that you go to for like traffic tickets, really, where citations are issued to these companies, and then they're essentially having to like go pay a fine or go and negotiate there. I want to kind of characterize how I ended up finding that data and sort of what the journey was of getting there, because it wasn't really like I set out to be like, oh, I want to do a comprehensive review of like how Chicago's approaching this. Like a lot of people, I think I kind of backed into it by what was nearby. So I think I mentioned at the beginning, that our organization, Neighbors for Environmental Justice, got started because an asphalt plant opened up in our community. They're called Mad Asphalt. And so Chicago does have a data portal, and there's some stuff that's posted there, including some things about complaints and inspections by the Department of Public Health. And I had set up a little script that basically would send me an email every time a new inspection happened over there. And for a while, generally the pattern was there would be complaints, then sometimes there would be an inspection, and if there was an inspection, sometimes there would be a ticket. If they were documenting, that it smelled really bad, or people were, that there's visible emissions, or it's blowing over the property lines, and all that kind of stuff. After a while, though, I noticed a change in the pattern, which was that they would still document the same kind of things, but whereas previously it might document that stuff and then end with a notice of violation being issued, they would document the same kind of behaviors, and it would end with an enforcement action is already pending, or an enforcement action is pending. Or sometimes it would just say CDPH will continue to observe and investigate. And I was like, what does this mean? I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so you can see this is what it looked like, right? I get these emails and I start seeing this language showing up. And I'm like, are they planning a sting operation here? Like, what is a pending enforcement action supposed to actually mean? So in this case, because they do have a bunch of these inspection records that are all in the city's data portal, I just went back and started searching for any other records that used that language, like, everything that has like enforcement and pending, in the description. And so I found a bunch of stuff, and some of it was relevant, some of it wasn't. But a couple of things had jumped out at me right away. And eventually what I found when I went far enough back was a few that were pretty explicit, where they said, due to pending enforcement, I documented this activity for consideration. And basically what it meant was that if you've already got tickets, we're not going to give you more tickets, which really surprised me. I was like, it didn't make sense to me as how you would kind of, my understanding of kind of the adversarial model of law, right, is that, if they're trying to get you to plead to something, or if they want you to change your behavior, usually they'll kind of stack things up, so they kind of have more leverage rather than kind of preventively say, well, we've already got something, so we're not going to do any more. And so in this case, I actually just emailed the assistant commissioner of the Department of Public Health, and I just was like, can you tell me about this? And so go ahead to the next one. And he just told me point blank that, like, we won't issue, we'll stop issuing tickets. He said typically we'll issue no more than 3. Sometimes it's more than 3. But yeah, when I got that email, that was where I was like, I'm going to need to learn more about this, because it really blew my mind that they would just say that. So basically, I was trying to figure out from there, where can I find the patterns, right? Where can I find some evidence of what they're actually doing? And there's an enforcement data set in the public portal, but it's kind of inconsistent. And when I talk to the people of the Department of Administrative Hearings, they're like, I don't know where that's coming from. That's not ours. I had originally kind of gotten in touch with them, just trying to follow up on a few tickets specifically, to be like, what happened with these? Again, kind of just started with this local company where I was like, I want to understand what's happening with these tickets. And it always led to some bigger questions, including there were a couple that were documented in inspections where they said, yeah, we issued these tickets. And then when I talked to the Department of Hearings, they're like, we don't have those tickets. We don't know anything about them. And so eventually I got to the point that I said, like, just give me everything. Give me everything that you've got in your system, as far back as you can go. And they are currently my favorite FOIA department. They called me up. They wanted to kind of understand it more. And then they gave it to me. They gave me, it was everything from like late 2001 up into the present. And actually, and you can see it here. And I should mention the Google Doc that Dillon shared has a link to the report that we put together. And at the end of that report, there are links to like all of our source data and a lot of the stuff that you're going to see here. So if you're interested in kind of taking a closer look at that part of it specifically, those resources are there. But before I talk a little bit more about this specific kind of record and like what it means, the other thing I just wanted to throw out there is I think I feel like when I'm doing FOIA requests, I sort of have a two big categories of like kind of FOIA requests that I'm filing. And this mostly it's like for things that I'm trying to understand and I don't know. And then there's FOIAing for things that like I'm pretty sure I know and I'm trying to prove, kind of like explore and expose, or something to that effect, right? And so sometimes getting a big picture of like, give me all the data you have. At this point, like I knew they were doing some things that were questionable around not issuing tickets, but I didn't have a full understanding of like what that looked like. And I wanted to understand how this process actually plays out. And so this was very kind of an open-ended way to approach it. Now what you can see here is that the data they gave me back is hearing level data. So at least in Chicago, the way that it works is that if you've got a company and they get inspected, right, and they're doing, they're found to be in violation of a few different laws, say, right, which might be like air pollution, failure to control your materials, business nuisance. You might have like 3 or 4 different things that they could be cited for. Each one of those things is a specific violation of a specific part of the municipal code. But they'll usually get bundled up. So like you might have 2 or 3 that are part of kind of one ticket, one notice violation number. And then also pretty much all the stuff that happens on one day is going to be put together as a docket, right? And that just means that like when they're doing hearing dates and when they're doing talking about stuff, like they're going to kind of keep all of those violations, as a bundle together to move through the system. And so what the data they gave me is it's hearing level data where every single row represents a hearing for a specific violation on a specific date. So if I was found violating, 4 different laws on a particular date, there would be 4 rows in here for the first hearing. And if they push it back and they do a second hearing, then there's going to be another 4 rows, right? And each one of those includes, both what it was that they were cited for, where it happened, the date it was issued, and like what was the outcome of that hearing, which might be that they were found liable. Usually the way that it works is there aren't a lot of people that are kind of going and contesting this stuff. Generally speaking, they're either working out a deal with the city where they'll plead liable to some of them and the city will what they call non-suit, right? Which means that they drop the other charges. That's kind of the most common way of this stuff happening is either companies are pleading liable or the city's dropping charges. That's kind of an end result. But as you might imagine, right, this is not the most helpful format. Like you can't really get a full picture of what's happening just by looking at like all this individual hearing level data. And so the next thing that I did, I think you can go to the next slide, is I had to kind of reshape it. And I do like data stuff and coding or whatever. And so in this case, I did a little bit of Python. And what I did is I kind of rolled it up. So I would say, okay, I want 1 row for every violation that got prosecuted. And I want to know, how many hearings there were, when was the first one, when was the last one, what was the final outcome, was there a fine, all that kind of stuff. And you can go ahead to the next slide, and you can see this is what it looked like when I was done with that process. I had 1 row for each thing that would tell me all these different kind of pieces about it. And I also, kind of collapsed some of the categories they use where they might say liable by plea or liable by contested finding or, not liable because of this or not liable because of that. I just was mostly interested in like, were they found liable or not? Did it get dropped or not? And so yeah, this is once I had it shaped together in this way, then I was able to start to do kind of look at the big picture and say, what do we see? What are the patterns here? Now, Chicago, we used to have a Department of Environment, and then under Rahm Emanuel, it was dismantled, and environmental enforcement was turned over to the Department of Public Health. And so part of the big frame of this analysis was like what happened when they did that. And I mean, you can take a look; it's pretty striking, right? That in an 11-year period after they dismantled it, they issued half as many tickets as the 10 years before. And if you're looking at air pollution, which is obviously something that we're super interested in, it's an even more stark drop. So already there was a pretty sharp image starting to emerge there, right? About what's happening. And then the other thing I want to mention here, and I should have put some more slides in here, but is something that came out of this was settlements and settlement agreements, which is that basically sometimes the city will reach a deal, and they'll like kind of show up in court, and they work it out, and they'll say to the judge, all right, we're here. They're going to plead liable to this one and not liable to these ones. And sometimes they'll attach a couple extra conditions, like you got to send us, a book report about how you're going to do better. And but they also have a thing called a settlement agreement, which is essentially like a binding contract that's outside of the Department of Hearings altogether, where they negotiate with these companies, and those kind of settlements agreements pretty much always result in the city dropping all the charges. And then, they might have a fine attached still. They might have, some requirements about you have to put in some new equipment or do a thing. But it also means that the company avoids having anything on their record that shows that they were found liable for, environmental violations. And one of the big findings in this report was that essentially there were kind of two tracks through all this. There were lots of violations being issued for like very minor things. Like construction site cleanliness. You got to have the right fence on your site. You got to have the right mesh on the fence, or whatever. And then those violations were being issued frequently, processed quickly, and they'd have like one hearing, and then that was it. Kind of like most of them were found liable, and they kind of move on. And then there was a much smaller subset of companies that are like these big companies that are, asphalt producers, metal shredders, places that are kind of systematically producing pollution. And those companies would be ticketed or cited much less frequently. And when they were ticketed or cited, it would get dragged out. Instead of 1 or 2 hearings, it'd be 10, 12, 15 hearings. And they had a higher than normal likelihood of ending with those charges being dropped, or ending with a settlement agreement where they didn't have to be found liable for anything. And oftentimes, there wouldn't even be any other consequences besides just like kind of a small fine, effectively. Small certainly from the perspective of these companies. So yeah, that's, you can read a lot more about that stuff in this report if you're interested in this, but I would think kind of the big picture from a records standpoint is that, it started with some publicly available stuff that was in the data portal, and trying to compare these things and learn what I could from there. And then I followed that up with a FOIA request to the Department of Administrative Hearings to get that big data set. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention here as a resource is that this is a tool that I built called Better Data Portal. It's www.betterdataportal.com. And this works for Chicago, but it actually also works for a bunch of other sites. And the idea here, right, is that one of the challenges of looking for public records is that sometimes you don't know what you're looking for, right? And a lot of these public data portals are really built around the idea that people will already know what they want to know. And so it's like you got to kind of go in there and be like, well, is there this kind of data set? Is there that kind of data set? You got to know if am I looking it up under like the agent name or the company name or this address, or it's hard to know kind of even what's on the menu. And so this is a much simplified kind of wrapper around all of that. And what it does is, for these data portals, you can just type in the address or the name of a place or a person or whatever, and it will do a keyword search of all of the data sets that are in that portal, and it'll give you all the results in one place. And it's a really, like, so when we get in, hear through the grapevine, oh yeah, well, I heard there's a new warehouse opening up over there. Or like, do you know anything about this thing that's supposed to be on, 53rd Street, and so like kind of my first stop is I'll come here and I'll plug it in and see that, there might be a business license or a building permit. There might be, oh, well, here's the complaints. Here's some inspections that already happened. Here's a lobbyist tied to that address. There's a lot of different things that you might find that are connected to that. And so this is a really good kind of starting point for trying to understand what sorts of records might be available in your jurisdiction, and depending on what you're looking for. So yeah, like I said, it starts with Chicago because that's kind of what I built it for. But because Chicago uses this platform that is popular with a lot of other places as well, you can also plug in any of those other data portal addresses. And there's a list of them on the site if you click through. But yeah, you can search for, some of them are state level, some of them are city level. There's counties that are on there. There's some international stuff, federal transportation things. So yeah, there's a lot of possibilities there. And if you're just trying to understand, I use it mostly for names and addresses and businesses, but you could do a lot of different kinds of things with it. And it's a good way to sort of just get a sense of what's out there and where you want to kind of cast a wide net first and then follow up to understand. So let me stop there. There's a lot, I realize. And do we want to do a little Q&A?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anthony, for getting into the weeds with us on that. That was really, really exciting. For the small group of people here, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself. So feel free to just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. If it's a longer question or you don't feel comfortable asking it here, you can leave it in the Google Doc that's in the chat, and I will check up there later and try to get back to you. Anthony's got a hard cutoff in about 10 minutes, but we can wait around for a few minutes if there are no immediate questions, but ideas are still percolating. We can just wait it out and see.
That's a great question. Is there an organization that tracks changes to state level laws regarding air quality standards and changes over time? Kind of a meta tracker. I don't know of one, but it's a great idea. Might be out there.
Yeah.
Oh, Lucy has her hand up.
Real quick before I get to Lucy, Ted, that's really interesting. I mean, I think, and Anthony and I have talked about this, is something I'm still really interested in, is the tracking things over time, especially related to air quality events or permits. I think permits are something that I don't fully understand where they are in different areas that I'm interested in. If I could get them at a single link and write something that like was able to basically like a Slack or an email bot that would notify me or any group of people when a new permit comes up. Because I think a lot of times people aren't even aware that these documents are there or aren't aware of them at the time that they need them. So I think that's a great question. Lucy, you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, thanks for both your presentations. I was wondering if either of you have heard from the city of Chicago DOIT folks. I don't know that they engage with any power users, but I was wondering if you've heard from them, or the data portal folks, of making any alterations to their portal. I don't know if that's any interest to you, or if you've gotten any feedback or expect any enhancements on their open data portal as a result of the work you've done?
I think that's a good question for Anthony. I'll let him take that.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely aware of it. Actually, I know that some of them have shared a little bit online, and I've actually followed up in a couple places where I was like, "Can you tell me what's up with this?" In particular, because like there's a 311 data set on the city portal that does not include air pollution. And I was like, "Can you? I know you've got it. Like, could it get added?" I know that also there's like a little bit of a renewed effort around some of this stuff that they've been making a push for more recently, and I know that they did just do some work recently to try and improve the 311 API. So like for people who are pulling data out that way, it wasn't really returning all the results. And so I've got some other folks I'm in touch with who had reached out over there, and they were trying to improve that a bit. And actually, I did just get an invite to a thing next week where they were looking to, I think, talk more about their digital services. So yeah, we do have I'm in touch with some people. And then I think at this point with them, it's mostly like, can we think about what data is available? Can we put things together in a way that makes them more available? I don't think they're going to kind of do anything that changes the fundamental way that like the platform works. And I think that's all right. I mean, there's reasons that it's all set up the way that it is, but I think it's an interesting kind of case study in like who you're thinking about when you build a thing, because a lot of these data platforms are really built around the people who will publish the data, and thinking about it from like a data publisher's perspective of this data set and that data set and this thing, and in this very kind of neutral, it could be anything kind of approach, which makes sense if you're coming at it from that perspective. But if you're just an ordinary person who wants to know like what's out there, that's very different than, and you just kind of want to be able to show up and search, rather than have to have a lot of other information ahead of it.
Well, I think that will be probably the end of my silent probe to see if there are any final questions. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. We hope you enjoyed the session today. Again, this was being recorded, so we will put it at the top of the Google Doc when it finds a home for everyone to access it at. And yeah, if you have any other feedback or thoughts, please do keep in touch.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all.